I'm curious, do you think the urge for freedom of self-defense kind of arises from that? Like in Australia, they kind of were able to remove self-defense from people without people having a problem with it. But in the United States, maybe people might want to have the ability to defend themselves because of that. Do you think that plays a role?
Brett, I had the same realization with BBJ. If you outweigh someone 20 pounds and that's muscle, they're going to have a very hard time submitting you. So just knowing the basics and, just like pull your chin in when they try to choke you out, just basic stuff like that. But I never, ever want to end up on the ground in a fight. If you're on the ground in a fight, that is a very, very bad position to be in. They can stomp your head, all sorts of things. Being good at striking makes sense. And then just the very basics of BBJ. But I think the rest of it is just kind of a waste. Like if any of us end up in that position, like we made a series of mistakes that should not have been made. And then two, I think the most useful thing is just staying on your feet and being able to strike efficiently. The biggest thing I found, the way you mitigate risk is one, don't place yourself in like risky environments. But, if we're going to go to the frontier, we're going to have fun. These countries are not that safe. And even the United States is not that safe now. It's, it's degenerating to some like failed Latino state. So in those environments where you need to do one, don't be disappeared in your cell phone when you're walking around. Like pay attention to your environment. These people are hyenas that are engaged in low level violence, right? They're not going to really come out a lion. I mean, they will if they're on drugs, even if it's just pot, which is fascinating. But for the most part, they will avoid you. And so like if a male is paying attention to you in some way that you shouldn't, or your kids or your woman or whatever, just briefly making eye contact and just moving your eyes to the side. Don't look down. Anything else, just that they know that you know. And they'll find someone else. These people are looking for easy targets. Again, they're hyenas. They don't like damage either. And then putting on as much muscle as possible. Muscle is a threat. Like that is damage that can be dealt to another being. And it's something in the limbic system, like they just know. Like if you have a bunch of musculature on you, they're probably going to leave you alone. And you're paying attention, right? That's the two things that are going to be a massive deterrent. The third thing is just not being in those bad environments. When I've had issues, it's when I'm out super late actually both times. And, it's usually almost always self-inflicted on my end. And I know better, but, sometimes you have to have fun, man. Sometimes, young men need to test themselves, right?
Call me out if I sound too idealistic here, but to me, it seems like the shifting power structures being biased towards violence has been due to humans trying to get access to basic human needs. Things like access to food, clean water, shelter, information, order. But the technology you're talking about also has the power to kind of let us provide these very things for ourselves. Imagine a single individual who is able to 3D print their house, filter their water with a machine, get their food from a 3D printed weapon and hunting, communicate peer-to-peer with anybody doing the same using a decentralized internet and a satellite constellation internet, and et cetera, right? So I'm just imagining that there's a possible reality where instead of saying we're going to fight for our freedom, we're just going to get the things we needed anyway as humans and just kind of do it ourselves. So I'm comfortable making this radical proposition of a changing of society because you just did the same. So I wonder what you think.
Yeah, I don't think so. Honestly, big picture in the quote unquote real world, like things in my practical existence, there's lots of theoretical reasons why governments can work or fail, right? And that's all theoretical. I think the best argument for why the United States has remained free for so long is a military that does not want to take over. I think we actually have a military that has a huge amount of integrity. Now, of course, there's going to be like problems here and there and whatnot, but I actually think the long story arc of the United States has to do with its weird idea of military nobility towards the end of freedom that started off in the late 18th century. Who knows why, but it worked. And we should not fuck it up because Naval's right. It is the engine for freedom in the world, right? I don't think that is debatable, right? But to protect it, really, I think we should all be very grateful to the military, not so much for killing people or for serving, although that too, but frankly for not taking over because they do have all the guns.
I agree with Julius. I agree with you about everything. And I think that you could stitch this into the modern dating. One advice to any man, if they want to become more high value and have more success in the dating pool, is also just to put on muscle. Both things are just alpha indicators. And I know there's something controversial about alpha, beta, etc. But what I mean is that alpha being a short-term phrase to summarize what is attractive to all ladies across all spectrums, just into their hind brain, if you will. And so putting on muscle is great for deterrence of the jackals and also for the dating.
The military cannot take over the United States, not when you have 40 million armed citizens. There's a sniper in every rooftop. Military has to sleep, has to eat, has to go to the cafe, has to go to the bathroom. It takes a 10-to-1 or 30-to-1 ratio of military to guerrillas when you have an active, engaged guerrilla force in the country. The population of the United States is sufficiently armed that a military takeover against the wishes of the populace simply is not possible unless it happens gradually with the disarmament of the populace.
So it's not the armed citizens necessarily that stop the military from taking over the United States, right? Like maybe right now, sure, that's the idea of it. But remember, the military has coexisted with all these civilians for a long time. And it is straightforward in any number of military conflicts too. Because also remember populism, right? So the military could easily say like, half of the gun people are on our side, so we're going to put Trump in office. And these decisions, they've been made instance by instance for over 200 years. So I don't think it's the 40 million people with guns. Like certainly that's a factor, but that leaves aside that any populist military person would of course appeal to the people with guns. So I think there's more credit to the military than just the existence of gun laws. Because you're describing invading. The military wouldn't invade. It would just take over power, right? There'd be probably no change really to the citizenry. So I think that particular analogy, I actually don't think it's durable as a criticism to at least my point about the discipline and integrity of the U.S. military going back hundreds of years. Look at what's happened in so many other countries with their militaries, even with similar structures.
No, I'm talking about the military taking over from the inside, not as an invading force. I'm talking about from the inside. Even then, an armed population can prevent the existing military from takeover. And the military is not a united force anyway, because it's made up of civilians as well. Now, the real failure scenario here is not the military taking over, it's intelligence agencies taking over. Because the moment you have secret police and secret courts and secret rules, and you have so many rules that everyone can be indicted for violating one of them by some random attorney general or another, and then you can have a secret court trying them over secret documents, then you start sliding into a junta. And unfortunately, that does begin to start seeing to be happening in a lot of Western countries where the intelligence agencies are the ones with too much power.
I know what you mean, but you're still taking it from the point of view of like two conflicting sides. This is a, over 200-year history, World War I, World War II, the Civil War, all these engagements. Like usually when the military quote unquote takes over a country, it doesn't do it against the country's will. It's just a natural thing that ends up happening because eventually someone reaches for power and legislative rules just can't stand in the way of physical force. And of course they do it intelligently. So anyway, I think the military deserves a lot of credit in this regard. However, I'm making this very narrow argument sort of to make that point. Of course, you're right in other instances. If the military were to try and like really inverted rebel, I guess, against like what the citizenry wanted, it would be impossible. That's not how it looks in other governments. That's sort of never how it plays out, right? It's some political disagreement then a military leader takes that step over the line, which is always there. And then the whole system's busted. And the fact that particular instance hasn't happened in the United States with its long military history, kind of amazing. And the latter part of your describing here, you're absolutely right about. That's a different thing. But you are absolutely right. Because it's not just the military. It's impressive. I think it's easiest for the military to take over. It's impressive that the military hasn't, but it can also be done legislatively through the court system. And as you say, this kind of gets back to our old like Dune conversation about bureaucracies. Like, as soon as like power gets held away from the voting base, like that's bad. And it's eventually going to need to be rebalanced or it'll be problems. And this is to remind everyone, it's the path from democracy to bureaucracy, to aristocracy, to autocracy.
I've had the privilege of hearing Naval make this argument before. Not that I didn't know it implicitly, but the way he made it explicit for me, I thought, that's it. That hits the nail on the head as to why Australia can get away with the ridiculous policy that it has. I say things like, we're privileged in Australia, and I was as a security guard, for example, not to have to deal with guns or gun violence. Well, that's true in a sense, but on the other hand, we are subject to government tyranny. But our government tyranny can only ever go so far because we have a virtuous, friendly United States. Over there on the other side of the world, sure, but they're also so friendly and virtuous. They'd come to our aid even if our government turned on us. I don't mean they'd necessarily come to our aid militarily and invade us, although that's a possibility. But what they do is they'd open up their arms to Australians who flee the place, as they do already everywhere. And then we'd be in a place where we'd truly be free. And the security of the world, no matter what minor contributions places like Australia make, or Canada, or New Zealand, or parts of Europe, I think the UK is kind of pulling their weight. But everyone in the world is getting away with barely contributing anything to global security in comparison because the United States commits so much to defence. And the United States commits so much to defence because their citizens commit so much to defence. It's a two-way street there. So both you've got the situation of the government being a little afraid of its own citizens and needing to continue to ramp up its own military in response. And you've got the people doing likewise. Every time the government decides to take on more power, the amount of guns that are sold go up. The average non-thinking normie on this, and I never use that term, but on this, I think it applies. They think this is all for the bad. They think this cycle of increasing arming, especially of the citizens, is a bad thing. They look at the statistics on gun violence and they say, look at what's happening. Well, okay, we can all admit that no one wants mass shootings, no one wants gun violence in certain communities. Yeah, that's fine. But that, of course, is not a problem of ever more guns. Mass shootings can be done with handguns. Mass shootings could have been done long before the situation that people find themselves in now. Are the statistics that different anyway? Let's say that they are. Something else is going on, not explained by the sheer number of guns. But so I don't lose sight and become distracted from the main point, Naval's exposition of this very truth about our circumstance in the world comes down to the United States has a Second Amendment that guarantees the freedom of the people to defend themselves, especially against the tyranny of government, extends not only to the United States, but it actually extends to the world. The freedom of the world is guaranteed by the United States. And even then, only by a small number of people within the United States, willing to take the Second Amendment seriously, willing to arm themselves, willing to protect themselves and therefore their nation, and actually the freedom-loving people of the West and the Enlightenment. It's no underestimation to say any of that. So I'm often driven in these situations to say things like, full credit to David Deutsch for everything I've just said. So here I will put the rider, full credit to Naval Ravikant for everything I just said there. I think it is one of the most refined and to the point expositions of what's going on in the world that is counter-culture to everything we're being told by the media and people on a certain side of politics that don't understand the importance not just of the Second Amendment, but of people taking the Second Amendment seriously, arming themselves, learning to use weapons, and bristling that country with firepower, pointed in every direction at anyone who dares threaten the Enlightenment.
In chimpanzees and in other mammals, reactive aggressiveness that is the characteristic of the dominant male of any group, the male that gets the mates, the male that gets the resources. And I think reactive aggressiveness is exactly what is keeping us safe. And Brett, I have to say that I don't know that if you get a lot of compliments and feedback on your content, but I am very grateful that you take the time to explicate these complex ideas in such an articulate way. And that now that I know that you were once a security guard as well, I think that just enriches, for me anyway, everything that you share. Naval and Keith seem to be talking past each other, and I think I know why. So yes, the military is an agent usually when it takes power of political forces. Agreed? But I think what's being missed here is that there's an arising complexity, which is not planned, I don't think, which comes from the growing state having more and more, being bigger and bigger as a percentage of GDP, the GDP growing bigger and bigger as a result of, I would boil it down to 5 factors. The first one being military hegemony, the second one being reserve currency hegemony, the third being a focus on free markets, the fourth being a focus on innovation in this country, and the last one being the most important, which is the rule of law. Now, the military has gotten bigger and bigger in a corrupt way, stirring up fake wars, coups, what have you, to deploy more and more of the munitions that are developed. That has a feedback loop. And again, it's a complex, maybe it's a 3-body problem where as one thing gets bigger, the other thing gets bigger, and then the corruption also grows. And it has benefits, but it also has terrible consequences for example, the size of the state and its chilling effect on innovation. So what we've done is, although I agree, this feedback loop, which has created this gigantic fucking tumor of a state apparatus and bureaucracy, it also has resulted in this gigantic military, which I agree has kept us safe. But ultimately, Naval is correct. It is the individual citizens of this state, of this country that, with their willingness to engage in violence, using the best, most effective tools of violence, that is, so far guns, with high capacity magazines and, a lot of high capacity magazines and high capacity output when you pull the trigger, automatic or semi-automatic weapons. And what's interesting to me is that we have now broken or disrupted the other 4 elements of the prosperity platform, which has supported both the state via its percentage of GDP through taxation and therefore paying for the military. And how have we done that? And I'm sorry, this is going long. I probably should chop this up in little pieces. But the how have we done that? We've done it in a couple of ways. We have grown the state in regulation, which has had a chilling effect on innovation. And we see that, all over the place. If the All In podcast did a very good episode on the sclerotic institutions, worth a listen. I think it was not this past drop, but the previous one. Then we have debased the currency. And yes, we're still the prettiest pig at the trough with regard to fiat currencies, but who knows for how long. So we've debased the currency. We have, now I'm rambling. What was the other one? Innovation. Free markets. We've squashed free markets through regulation. And then the last one, we've really fucked up now with the stupid politicized prosecution where, we have for Hunter Biden, the law is like a comfort blanket. Oh, poor Hunter. But for Trump, the law is a cudgel. And we're going to smack that guy in the head as hard as we can, as often as we can with the law. It reminds me of this Peruvian general who took power named Benavides, who had a quote attributed to him, which captures this idea very well, which is, for my friends, anything they want. For everybody else, the law.
That's very kind of you to say, and I take the compliment. I actually think it's a failing on my part because it's a violation of everything I stand for when it comes to talking about ideas. I want to take a moment to just unpack that. I think, and I'm sure you'd agree, and many people who first hear this absolutely agree, that the argument should stand on their own. It has nothing to do with the source. So what I'm doing, and even mentioning that I was on Mall Cop, is arguing from a place of authority. Believe me because I had experience kind of thing. I talk about education and learning a lot. The arguments I make come from a place of what I would say are good explanations about knowledge. And that should be the end of the matter when it comes to debating these things. But people often want to say, well, what do you know about how learning actually works? Try it in the real world. Well, I was a teacher for, close to 20 years. I dealt with all manner of kids, but that shouldn't matter. And who are you, Brett Hall, to talk about physics? You're not a physicist. Who are you to talk about mathematics? You're not a mathematician. Who are you to talk about any number of things that I talk about? And so I have this small section hidden away on my website somewhere, as many people do, saying, look, if you're still stuck in a place where you think argument from authority is a thing, here are my credentials. That too is a failing on my part to even put that there, to even mention it, and to again do it here now.
No, I think so. I don't think so. That's just what a synchronous quick chat looks like. I think we're just making different points because I agree with him to a certain extent, and I doubt he would disagree with me on, the integrity of the military being somewhat involved. So, but they're just very different cases. And then, as you point out, it's a very complicated system. So, Brett, even down in Australia, I don't think it's guns or no guns because we can find counterexamples everywhere. So there's something bigger going on, and it's lots of different components, and guns are definitely part of it. Integrity of military and then other institutions is another part of it. So, but mainly, I don't think we're talking past each other. I think we're talking.
Because none of it matters. There's lots of other things from everyone's history that they could call on. So it should never matter what a person's history is, what their experiences have been. What matters are the arguments they make, and they should be evaluated in their own terms. Take arguments that are made by very wealthy people about how to make wealth, how to have the life you want, and that kind of thing. And then people say, well, it's all right for you. You're a multi-millionaire or a billionaire, that kind of thing. And it's like, you know nothing about this person's past. You don't know the absolute poverty they were in, how they had to struggle, what they needed to do in order to find their way to wealth.
And I think everyone's mature enough to be able to hold special cases in our mind, right? So gun rights are definitely a big part of why the United States has remained free. However, it's not just the guns, right? Because the Swiss have almost universal gun ownership, as do most mandatory military countries. So it's not just the guns. But again, I'm not taking anything away from his argument, nor do I think he's taking much away from mine besides we reframed. And I don't know if he disagrees. I suppose I would disagree back, but I don't think so. And this is just conversation.
It shouldn't matter that they came from poverty and had to work really hard and then learn the lessons to create the wealth. What should matter is listen to the arguments. Listen to the validity of the arguments themselves and evaluate those. But I admit, not everyone is there with that lesson. They don't understand that you should evaluate arguments on the basis of their validity. So therefore, with those people, you kind of do have to concede, all right, they don't get it. They don't get that you have to evaluate arguments in terms of the validity of the arguments objectively. So they need to be told, hey, I'm arguing from a place of authority. I've had the experience. I know exactly what you're going through, where you're coming from. I'm telling you, I've been through that. I've lived it, and I'm telling you how to get out of it. It reminds me of another intellectual hero of mine, Yaron Brook, who was a great defender of Ayn Rand's objectivism. I always make the writer. I don't agree with everything that he says or that Ayn Rand says, but I'm just saying he's a very good defender of these ideas and of liberty and of reason and all this sort of stuff. And people sort of say, oh, you live in an ivory tower, you don't really understand what you're talking about, you haven't lived in the real world. Yaron Brook was in the Israeli military. Yaron Brook understands violence. Yaron Brook understands how to struggle. Yaron Brook was once upon a time a socialist, all this sort of stuff. So he gets it.
Well, but here is the thing. It does matter because the validity of the arguments cannot be evaluated as effectively anywhere else than in the real world. So I get the kind of, I think, validity point you're making, but not every intellectually sound argument actually lands on being true in the real world. And now we're going to talk about math again. How you doing, man?
He rarely mentions that, and quite right, because it doesn't matter what his personal history is. It's the arguments that matter, not his authority arguing from a place where, he's had the real life experience. That is irrelevant. But he feels like he needs to make the argument now and again. And fair enough, I get it. I feel that impulse as well. I try to avoid it, but I'm unsuccessful in doing so.
I mean, this is really why free markets work, right? Is that it's actually happening in the real world. Real money is changing place. You're not just seeing if that relationship is possible. You're seeing how much it works compared to all other relationships in this kind of spectrum that we call a free economy or an economy. It does matter what his personal history is. Reputation, trust, these things still matter. Maybe not for much longer, and maybe there are times when it doesn't work, but there's a reason. Yeah, there's a reason. And by the way, this is why it's good they prosecute Trump, because he wasn't worthy of the office, and he probably broke the law, and that's not a political persecution. Now, it might be a mistake for the country, but it's not a mistake for ethics.
The only one who is really, really good at this, I'd say near perfect at this, to lionize my hero once again, is David Deutsch. I won't say no one knows, some people do know, but publicly, no one knows what his personal history is, what his experiences are, what he went through as a child, what his experiences were growing up, where he came from, any of that stuff. His personal history is opaque to most people. And he does this deliberately, I would say.
And while I'm insulting people, this or political vantage points, this RFK thing, like, yeah, sure, great. You want to frame it in terms of the vaccine? Sure, do that. What about him being a cupcake bullshit politician for the last 15 or 20 years? I'm from Massachusetts. I know the Kennedys. Don't call Robert Kennedy a serious politician. I'm sorry. And also, the cute, well, I don't want serious politicians. Sure, fine. But we need integrity. And do you think this is integrity? I don't know. You know it when you see it. And it does matter. And if he broke the law, he should go to jail.
He never wants anyone to think that he's arguing from a place of authority. He just wants you to look at the arguments. That's it. It's got nothing to do with him. And so he's been so good at this throughout his life, of just not talking about his past. Not because he wants to keep things private, although, of course, that's a crucial part of this, but because he doesn't want to have to concede to anyone from the position of, well, you don't know what you're talking about because you never had this experience. You don't know what you're talking about because, for example, you personally haven't raised lots of children, or you personally haven't gone through tough times. He doesn't talk about any of that. And he has had experience with these things. But it shouldn't matter whether he has or he hasn't. It's about the arguments. And so he's very good at keeping all of that opaque. And just one small thing here. Sorry, all of my recent chits are apparently replying to Keith, but they're not supposed to be replying to Keith. They're replying to someone who was praising me, complimenting me. So apologies, Keith. These weren't in response to anything you said. They're a response to something that someone who complimented me for having been a security guard was saying. And I thought that was a very, very generous compliment. But I was just saying that Nice as that is, it shouldn't be relevant to anything that I say on these matters of self-protection.